Sometimes the most eye-opening insights into a particular world or a specific time don't come neatly packaged in a single report.
No.
They are scattered across different kinds of sources, maybe a dry legal document, an excerpt from a book on a weighty topic, or even just a collection of articles and notes from within a professional association's own publication.
Absolutely. It's like looking through several different windows at the same scene. Each source offers a unique perspective, revealing different layers from the formal debates and administrative challenges down to the personal experiences and cultural quirks of the people who inhabit that world.
That's precisely the mission of the deep dive. We take the stack of source materials you've shared with us and dive deep, pulling out the most important nuggets of knowledge, the surprising facts, and the genuinely useful insights.
Right.
It's about cutting through the information overload to give you the well-informed shortcut.
And the sources you've brought us today are a fascinating mix. We've got a legal case title, an excerpt from a book dealing with a very serious subject, the murdered sex workers known from the Frankston serial killer case, and then a selection of articles and notes from a Victorian bar publication, specifically from around 2005. It's a blend of the formal, the tragic, the administrative, and the personal.
It is. We're talking legal, administrative, cultural, and even personal anecdotes, all contained within these documents.
Throughout range.
Our goal for this deep dive is to unpack all of it, to see what these sources tell us about a specific time and place, the Victorian legal world, roughly 2 decades ago, in 2005, and explore some of the broader themes and tangential topics they touch upon.
Okay.
We're going to extract the key insights and striking details just for you.
All right, let's open up these sources and take a close look at the Victorian legal landscape as it appeared through these eyes back in 2005.
So right away, when you start looking through these sources, particularly the material from that Victorian bar publication, you get this strong sense of a legal profession that wasn't static.
No, definitely not.
It was actively involved in significant debates and facing pressures for change.
That's one of the first things that struck me, too. This wasn't a profession resting on its laurels. The sources immediately paint a picture of a legal world engaging in fundamental discussions about its own structure, its core principles, and its role in society.
And what were the big debates bubbling up at that time? The outline points towards discussions around judicial independence, court administration, sentencing philosophy, and the regulation of the profession itself.
Exactly. You see a clear tension between upholding established traditions and adapting to modern demands and community expectations.
Right.
These debates weren't just academic, they were directly impacting how justice was delivered and how the profession operated.
And arguably, nowhere was that tension more visible and hotly contested than in the controversy surrounding the proposed acting judges bill. Can you tell us about that?
Okay, yeah. This was a piece of legislation introduced by the government that aimed to allow the appointment of acting judges in Victoria. Now, on the surface, that might sound like a minor administrative detail, perhaps a way to deal with temporary workloads or absences. But the reaction it triggered, according to these sources, was anything but minor.
The sources highlight that the opposition was significant, coming directly from the top tiers of the judiciary.
It really was.
The heads of the 3 key Victorian courts, the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, the Chief Judge of the County Court, and the Chief Magistrate were unanimous in their opposition.
That unanimity is incredibly rare and speaks volumes about the perceived threat this bill posed.
Yeah.
When the leaders of the state's highest courts are all saying no, it sends a powerful message.
And you have voices within the bar publication echoing and amplifying those concerns. Justice John D. Phillips, in particular, is quoted extensively, and his remarks are quite forceful.
They are. He drew a very sharp line. He wasn't necessarily against the concept of an acting judge in extremely limited specific circumstances, perhaps for a single case or a very short period.
Okay.
What he strongly objected to was the idea of institutionalizing temporary appointments as a routine part of the court system, particularly appointments made at the discretion of the executive government.
And his reasoning. What was the core issue for him?
His core argument was rooted in the fundamental principle of judicial security of tenure.
Right, the idea that judges hold their jobs permanently, essentially.
Exactly. This is a cornerstone of judicial independence. It means judges hold their office without fear of arbitrary removal by the government, protecting them from political pressure when making difficult or unpopular decisions.
So he saw the potential for the executive to appoint temporary judges who might feel less secure or potentially more beholden to the government that appointed them. Is that the idea?
Precisely. Justice Phillips felt that acting judges appointed in this way were anathema, a complete contradiction to the very nature of a court exercising independent judicial power.
Anathema. Wow.
Yeah, strong word. He argued that in a relatively small community like Victoria, judges needed that rock-solid security of tenure to be truly fearless and impartial, free from any suggestion of bias or susceptibility to influence or corruption.
Oh.
Allowing the executive to routinely appoint temporary judges risked eroding public confidence in the judiciary's independence.
It's a potent argument linking a seemingly technical change directly to the fundamental integrity of the justice system.
It really highlights how deeply principles matter in the legal world. However, the sources also give us the government's perspective at the time, primarily through the Attorney General, Rob Hulls.
And he defended the bill, presumably, arguing it didn't undermine judicial independence?
Yes. He argued that the bill was not intended to threaten the judiciary's independence. He even referenced the High Court decision in Nellis v. Bradley.
Okay, what did that case say?
Well, while it did find that state courts could constitutionally appoint acting judges under their framework critically, the High Court also included warnings about the potential for such appointments to threaten independence depending on how they were implemented.
So the Attorney General was saying, look, the High Court says it's permissible, but perhaps not fully engaging with the High Court's cautionary notes or the specific concerns about the bill's structure as raised by the Victorian judiciary.
That seems to be the implication from how it's presented here. The government framed the bill as part of a broader effort to modernize the justice system, making it more accessible and efficient for the community.
Right.
The idea was likely that temporary judges could help clear backlogs or fill gaps more flexibly.
But the sources suggest the political process wasn't smooth. They mention limiting debate, using something called a guillotine, and voting largely followed party lines.
Yes, the guillotine is a parliamentary procedure used to force a vote on a bill after a certain amount of time, regardless of whether debate is finished.
I'm a bit heavy-handed.
Well, it's often used by governments to push through legislation quickly. Its use here suggests the government was determined to pass the bill despite the strong opposition and limited further discussion.
So this wasn't a collaborative reform effort. It was a legislative battle with deeply held principles on both sides.
Exactly. And it poses that critical question that the sources implicitly raise. How do you effectively balance the undeniable need for efficiency and flexibility in a modern court system with the absolute non-negotiable requirement to protect judicial independence and maintain the public's trust in that independence?
Yeah.
It's a tension that runs through many legal reform debates.
And speaking of broader reforms, the sources also touch on other changes happening in the court system around 2005, often linked to what was called the Justice Statement.
Right. The context provided is that these were initiatives aimed at improving the court system's responsiveness to community needs, with a particular focus on marginalized and vulnerable individuals who might have complex issues, bringing them into contact with the law.
This moved beyond just process and efficiency, then, to thinking about the type of justice being delivered and who it was serving.
Precisely. And we see concrete examples in the sources through the description of what are termed problem-solving jurisdictions.
Problem-solving jurisdictions, like what?
They list courts like the drug court, which aims to address addiction as an underlying cause of crime. The sex worker list, designed to handle legal matters with sensitivity and specific understanding. The family violence court, focusing on the complexities of family abuse cases. And the Koori court, which involves Indigenous elders and community members in the sentencing process for Indigenous offenders.
So the purpose wasn't just to determine guilt or innocence, but to get at the root causes and try to break cycles of offending or vulnerability.
Exactly. The idea was to use the court setting not just for punitive measures, but as a place to connect individuals with support services and address the underlying issues that led them there. Sort of a holistic approach.
Were there other initiatives mentioned along these lines?
Yes, the sources mention initiatives like increasing the jurisdictional age limit for the Children's Court's criminal division, reflecting a recognition that young people in the justice system have distinct needs. They also highlight efforts to better support victims of crime, aiming to improve their experience within the court system, assist in their recovery, and even explore the potential for a victim's charter to formally outline their rights and entitlements.
The stated goal for these wide-ranging reforms was to bring greater certainty and transparency to judicial conduct, and the overall system, moving away from what the sources described as a more fragmented or ad hoc approach.
Yes, trying to create a more cohesive and predictable system while simultaneously making it more adaptable and sensitive to individual circumstances. It's a tricky balance.
And these reforms, while seemingly progressive, also raise fundamental questions, according to the sources.
They did. The bar publication pieces pose critical questions like, what is the actual cost to public confidence if the courts don't respond effectively to evolving community needs?
Right.
How do we even assess what the required response is, and how do we measure the success of these new approaches?
Good point.
And are we, as a system, moving too quickly with these changes, risking unintended consequences, or are we moving too slowly, failing to keep pace with societal needs?
Those are enduring questions that resonate far beyond 2005. They speak to the fundamental challenge of reforming any large, complex public institution.
Indeed. It shows that even when the goal is positive, improving responsiveness and addressing vulnerability, the path forward is fraught with debate and uncertainty.
Shifting focus slightly from court structure to a specific area of legal decision-making, the sources also highlight the ongoing public debate around sentencing.
Yes. The sources describe this debate in rather stark terms, calling it often a law and order bidding war that generates more heat than light.
That phrase, more heat than light, perfectly captures the often uninformed, politically charged nature of public discussion around crime and punishment.
It does. It's difficult to have a nuanced conversation about the complex purposes of sentencing punishment, deterrence, rehabilitation, community protection, when the discourse is dominated by calls for harsher penalties, often in response to specific, highly publicized cases.
And the sources bring in voices from within the legal system pushing back against this. The Attorney General, Rob Hulls, is again mentioned, emphasizing the fundamentals that are essential to the justice system.
He stressed the importance of a fearless and independent judiciary that has the discretion to impose sentences appropriate to the specific facts and circumstances of each individual case. And he also highlighted the crucial role of a fearless and independent Office of Public Prosecutions, emphasizing that decisions about whether to prosecute a case or appeal a sentence must be based purely on the facts, the law, and the broader public interest, free from political interference or public pressure.
These are core principles often lost in the bidding war rhetoric. And the premier at the time, Steve Brax, is mentioned as affirming the government's position against mandatory sentencing.
Right. Mandatory sentencing removes judicial discretion, prescribing fixed or minimum sentences for certain crimes regardless of the individual circumstances.
Which can lead to unfairness.
Opponents argue it can lead to unjust outcomes and undermines the role of the judge. The premier's stance was significant in a political environment, often pressured by tough-on-crime narratives.
So the sources show that back in 2005, even amidst the public clamor for harsher penalties, key figures within the government and legal system were publicly defending the principles of judicial discretion and the independent role of the DPP.
It underscores the tension between political expediency, public demand, and the core principles of the rule of law. The challenge then, as now, is how to foster an informed public debate about sentencing, grounded in evidence and legal principles, rather than one driven by emotion and political point scoring.
It sounds like a familiar struggle.
It absolutely does resonate with contemporary discussions.
Moving from the broad strokes of legal reform and public debate, the sources also give us a much more granular view, taking us inside the Victorian bar itself, looking at its administration and culture through the eyes of its CEO.
Yes, there's a fascinating piece profiling Christine Harvey, who was the CEO of the Victorian Bar at the time. You get a sense of the operational realities of running a professional association.
Her background is interesting. She wasn't just an administrator. She was a legal practitioner herself, with degrees in arts and law, admitted in other jurisdictions like the ACT and NSW, and had experience in government, private practice, and even served as a special magistrate.
That diverse background likely gave her a unique perspective on the challenges facing barristers.
Definitely.
Her role is described as running the Bar Council office, overseeing staffing, HR, premises, finance, and supporting the chairman and the various committees that do a lot of the bar's work. She reported directly to the Bar Council, which is the elected body governing the bar.
And she identified specific problems or challenges she saw for the Victorian bar. What were they?
Yes, she was quite candid. She contrasted the Victorian bar situation with difficulties she saw facing national organizations like the Law Council of Australia, which she felt were potentially under threat due to resource issues and internal politics among constituent bodies.
Okay, but for the Victorian bar specifically.
She pinpointed challenges like the need for better communication, both internally amongst the barristers themselves and externally to the wider public and government.
Right.
She saw a need to raise the bar's influence and improve the public image of barristers.
Because they were sometimes just seen as a generic part of the legal profession, not a distinct branch with its own specific role. Like people don't always know the difference between a barrister and a solicitor.
Precisely. She wanted to lift the image of barristers as a subset of the group of lawyers. She also noted issues with getting timely and effective consultation from both the Victorian and Commonwealth governments, feeling the delays weren't due to the bar side. These are practical challenges of relevance, communication, and government relations.
What stood out to you about her perspective on the bar itself?
What's particularly striking, and perhaps a counterpoint to the challenges, is her emphasis on the strong sense of volunteerism she found at the bar.
Volunteerism.
Yes. Despite being busy practitioners, barristers were apparently very willing to contribute their time, energy, and ideas by serving on committees. She found this culture refreshing and unique compared to other associations she'd encountered.
That paints a picture of a professional body with genuine engagement from its members, even if facing external challenges.
It suggests a strong underlying commitment to the profession and its self-governance, which is quite powerful.
The sources also touch on how specific legislation impacted the bar's regulatory role. This sounds important.
Yes, particularly the Legal Profession Act 2004 and the subsequent Consequential Amendments Bill 2005. These acts were significant overhauls of the legal profession's regulation in Victoria.
What were some of the key changes mentioned?
One notable change was a limitation on the delegation of the Legal Services Commissioner's functions.
Okay, what does that mean practically?
Well, previously, aspects of the disciplinary process, including the prosecution of charges after an investigation, had been handled by the bar itself. The new act shifted some of that away, centralizing certain functions with the commissioner.
That sounds like a move towards greater external oversight rather than purely self-regulation.
It does. It reflects a broader trend in professional regulation towards independent bodies handling disciplinary matters. Another significant change mentioned was the allocation of the Public Purpose Fund.
The Public Purpose Fund, can you explain briefly what that is?
Sure. Think of it as a pool of money generated from interest earned on solicitors' and barristers' trust accounts, which are accounts holding client money. Historically, this fund has been used to support various legal-related purposes, legal aid, education, law reform, that kind of thing.
NEMJ's in 2005.
The previous legislation apparently named specific bodies like the Victoria Law Foundation, the Leo Cusson Institute, which provides practical legal training, and the Victorian Law Reform Commission as beneficiaries, often with limits on how much they could receive.
Right.
The new act omitted specific reference to these bodies and broadened the category of who could receive funds and for what purposes.
So it went from specific named recipients to a more general criteria. Less certainty for those specific bodies.
Exactly. Funds can now be paid to any person or body for purposes including law reform, legal education, and research, but also included a very broad catch-all, any purpose relating to the legal profession or the law that the board considers appropriate.
Wow, that seems like a significant shift in control and discretion over those funds.
It could have major implications for bodies that previously relied on guaranteed funding. The sources also note that the bar lost its RPA status, a designation related to its regulatory authority.
RPA.
Responsible Professional Association, I think. While there was hope mentioned for the bar retaining a substantial role in regulating barristers under the new framework, it's clear this legislation represented a significant transition and potential reduction in the bar's traditional self-regulatory powers. Christine Harvey, as CEO, was involved in the implementation meetings, highlighting the practical work required to navigate these changes.
So you see these legislative changes pushing the bar towards greater external oversight and potentially less control over resources like the Public Purpose Fund.
It's a picture of the profession adapting or being required to adapt to a changing regulatory environment.
And running alongside these administrative and legislative shifts is the perennial question of tradition versus modernity, perhaps best symbolized in the legal world by the debate over wigs.
Ah, yes, the wigs. The sources dedicate some space to this, detailing the history. They mention the popular image influenced by characters like Rumpole of the Bailey,
Of course.
and the specific event in 1988 when the family court controversially dispensed with wigs, only to reintroduce them after attacks on judges, citing security concerns as wigs could provide a degree of anonymity or formality.
Security concerns. Interesting. The Victorian Bar had its own vote on this, didn't it?
Yes, in 1997, the Victorian Bar members voted decisively to retain wigs.
So the barristers themselves wanted them.
It seems so. The sources also recount how the Bar Council resisted a threat from the Attorney General in 2000 to legislate a ban, arguing it was a matter for the courts themselves to decide on appropriate attire, not the executive government.
And at the time these sources were written, in 2005, where did things stand?
The Victorian courts themselves favored the retention of wigs, and wearing them was the practice in those courts. So despite the debates and threats of legislative change, tradition held sway, supported by both the bar and the courts.
It's fascinating that something seemingly like a piece of clothing becomes such a point of contention, linked to issues of identity, authority, tradition, and even physical security.
It highlights the deep symbolic meaning attached to these traditions within the legal profession, and that adherence to formality extended to other areas too.
The sources mention the formal court dress code for admissions to practice, like when someone officially becomes a lawyer.
Exactly. It specifies the required attire for barristers moving the admission of a new lawyer. Wig, gown, bar jacket, and a jabot.
A jabot. That's that. Sounds fancy.
It's that frilly or pleated neckwear worn under the gown, like lace at the neck.
Ah, right.
It sounds like the bar office even had to send out reminders to members about the proper attire and the precise wording required for the motion in court to admit someone.
So while major legislative battles were being fought, the bar was also making sure the sartorial traditions were being upheld down to the last detail.
It reinforces that picture of a profession navigating significant external pressures while also maintaining strong internal traditions and rituals. It's quite the contrast.
Speaking of the practicalities, the sources also give us insights into the business of law itself, how barristers charge for their services, and the different styles of legal advice.
This is where you get a real timestamp on the sources. The references to specific fee schedules from 2005 are like looking into a different era in terms of monetary values.
Can you give us some examples? What did things cost back then? Take us back.
While the sources list specific charges, the price for writing a letter was set at $33.10.
$33 for a legal letter.
Wow. Specific attendances, presumably short meetings or tasks, were priced at $41.20. Even a phone attendance by a junior clerk had a specific charge, $17.90.
It gives a sense of the granular way time and tasks were accounted for. Very specific.
Exactly. And there was a framework for charging for more unusual or complex work based on principles of fairness and reasonableness. The sources also get quite specific about loan negotiation fees.
How so?
There was a detailed breakdown of how remuneration was divided when another legal practitioner was involved in the negotiation. The rule was 2/3 of the fee would go to the mortgagees, the lender's practitioner, and 1/3 to the mortgagors, the borrower's practitioner.
Interesting split.
This was contrasted with situations where a non-legal agent was used, or if the borrower contributed their own money. There's even a specific percentage mentioned for loan renewal fees, 0.55%.
These specific examples really ground the discussion in the economic realities of practice at the time. But then you have this article titled, Call the Unreasonable Man, which offers a very different perspective on the delivery of legal services. This sounds intriguing.
This is a great anecdote that highlights a key tension. The article recounts a situation where a barrister delivered a very long, presumably very thorough and detailed legal opinion to a client.
Right, covered all the bases.
You'd think. The client's reaction, dismissing it entirely as utter bullshit.
Ouch. So the lawyer delivered what they saw as comprehensive, careful advice, and the client found it useless.
Precisely. The article explores the contrast between the traditional approach of providing exhaustive legal opinions that cover every angle and potential risk, and the client's need for something much more concise, direct, and commercially focused.
Yeah.
The client in the anecdote didn't want years of hypotheticals. They needed a quick, clear yes or no to enable them to make a business decision, take a calculated risk, and move forward.
It sounds like a clash between academic legal rigor and real-world commercial urgency. The classic lawyer versus business person disconnect.
It is, and the title itself, Call the Unreasonable Man, plays on a fundamental concept in law, the reasonable person or reasonable man standard.
That hypothetical average person whose actions are used to measure whether someone acted negligently or reasonably in a given situation. The person on the Clapham omnibus sort of thing.
Exactly. It's a legal fiction. The article points out the paradox that this crucial figure in legal reasoning can never actually be called as a witness in court. You can't put the reasonable man on the stand.
Right. So the title connects the abstract, theoretical standards of the law to the very practical, sometimes frustrating reality of delivering legal advice to real clients who might not fit the reasonable mold or have very different priorities.
It's a neat way to frame the challenge lawyers face in bridging the gap between legal principles and practical commercial demands. The sources also briefly mention debates around cost ceilings under the Appeal Costs Act,
Okay.
noting how the application of limits by the Appeal Costs Board affected existing rights depending on when an indemnity certificate was granted, highlighting complex issues of retrospective application in practice. Just another layer of complexity in the business side.
These details show that the business of law isn't just about hourly rates. It's about how value is perceived, how advice is delivered, and the ongoing complexities of billing and cost recovery within regulatory frameworks.
It really rounds out the picture, showing the economic and practical pressures alongside the legal and administrative ones.
Beyond the formal structures and business aspects, these sources also open windows into the lives of the people within the Victorian legal world, their careers, their travels, and their moments of reflection.
This section really brings the human element to the forefront. We get glimpses through the farewells and welcomes documented in the publications.
For example, the farewell for Justice Wilczek from the family court after nearly 2 decades. What did they say about him?
Yes, his profile is quite moving. He's described with deep respect, compassionate, fair-minded, thorough, careful, and highly capable.
High praise.
And his personal history is compelling, too. Born in Czechoslovakia just before World War II, escaping to Austrian refugee camps, coming to Australia, juggling university studies with multiple jobs, returning to journalism before finally embarking on his legal career, practicing in a suburban firm with a focus on common law.
It paints a picture of a person who arrived in Australia as a refugee and rose to the judiciary through hard work and dedication. Quite a journey.
Absolutely. And the sources specifically note his considered judgments and, importantly, his respectful treatment of practitioners who appeared before him, a quality often highly valued by lawyers.
Definitely. And then on the other side of the coin, the welcome for Justice Kevin Bell to the Supreme Court.
His background highlights a different path, perhaps more rooted in community legal services. Educated locally, degrees from Monash University, remembered during his time as an articled clerk as being energetic, inventive, and compassionate.
And his involvement in community law is highlighted? That seems significant.
Very much so. He was involved with crucial organizations like the Tenants Union Legal Service and the Western Region Community Legal Center. He even coordinated a poverty law practice project.
Wow.
This background suggests a deep commitment to access to justice and representing vulnerable clients.
His expertise in specific areas is also noted.
Yes, he's credited with significant skill in native title cases, even mentioned as having turning the case on its head in one instance, which suggests a real intellectual prowess and ability to see things differently.
These biographical snippets, along with brief mentions of others welcomed or farewelled, like Justice Felicity Hample, Master Charles Wheeler, and obituaries for figures like Michael Thomas Rush, a criminal lawyer known as a great advocate, and Geoffrey Standish Lester, who worked on Canadian Constitution land rights, provide a tangible sense of the people who shaped the profession and contributed to the law in different ways.
They remind us that behind the formal titles and legal debates are individuals with diverse life experiences and passions. It's not just about abstract principles.
And those passions clearly extended beyond the courtroom, as evidenced by the fantastic travelogues included in the sources. We have 2 pieces taking us far from Melbourne, return to Bangladesh, and Beijing to St. Petersburg by train. These sound amazing.
These articles are pure gems. The Bangladesh piece offers incredibly vivid and candid observations. The author describes the overwhelming traffic, a living mass of people.
I could picture that.
The surprising sight of soldiers with submachine guns for security, the paradox of the smog somehow feeling relatively cleaner than before, and the stark, almost confronting discrepancy between the luxury of the hotel and the pervasive poverty visible outside.
It sounds like a sensory overload, both visually and emotionally. A real culture shock, perhaps.
It does, and the author's legal and social observations are equally sharp. They note the many faces of corruption, the perhaps surprisingly free media reporting on judicial behavior, suggesting some level of accountability.
Interesting.
The concerning perception that many local lawyers lacked basic legal knowledge and significant problems with education infrastructure.
They also note the rise of Islamic madrasa schools as a significant trend, sometimes seen as a challenge to the established secular education system.
Yes, adding another layer of social complexity. And a particularly challenging topic the author grapples with is child labor.
Oh, right. How do they approach that?
They recount hearing a range of local views on this issue, from outright denial to claims it's confined to specific economic zones, to a pragmatic acceptance if conditions are deemed adequate, or simply seeing it as a fact of life.
And this is contrasted with the perspective of an outsider, like the author, who views it as fundamentally unacceptable.
Exactly. It highlights a difficult moral dilemma and the vast difference in perspectives shaped by economic reality and cultural context versus external ethical standards. It avoids being preachy and just presents the conflicting views encountered.
That's a sensitive way to handle it, but it wasn't all difficult observations. There were positive experiences, too.
Absolutely. The author describes being struck by the energy and resilience of ordinary people and expresses deep gratitude for the incredible hospitality shown by members of the Bangladeshi Bar Council presidents and other lawyers who opened their homes.
That sounds wonderful.
They also attended the Victory Day Parade, which sounds like a fascinating cultural experience involving lawyers, the Communist Party, political chants, and even an amusing brush with TV fame during the event.
Huh. And the teaching experiences. What was that like?
They taught keen students in Chittagong, noting the vital support provided by a Bangladeshi advocate trained in the UK, Sodia Arman, who helps with translation and navigating cultural nuances.
That must have been essential.
Definitely. The author highlights interesting differences in the Local Evidence Act, noting that character evidence was permitted in ways that would be surprising to Australian lawyers, while simultaneously containing advanced concepts regarding dealing with confessions.
Fascinating contrast.
There's a telling anecdote about using a teaching problem involving a gambler and how the students focused heavily on his character rather than the legal elements of the problem, which speaks to different legal education approaches or cultural perspectives.
What an incredible multi-layered experience documented there.
Yeah.
And then the second travel piece, the epic Beijing to St. Petersburg by train journey. This sounds like a bucket list trip for some.
This sounds like a grand classic adventure, but with plenty of unexpected realities. The description of Beijing alone is striking the immense traffic problem with 30,000 cars being sold a month.
30,000 cars a month in 2005. That's mind-boggling. The scale is hard to comprehend.
It is. And yet, the author notes a surprising efficiency despite the congestion, though crossing the road is described as not for the faint-hearted, I can imagine.
Preparation sounds key for the train journey itself. What kind of prep?
Absolutely. The necessity of being prepared with essentials like toilet paper is mentioned a common piece of advice for lengthy international train travel.
The small comforts matter.
They really do. The description of the incredibly long stop at the Mongolian-Russian border station, Sushbatar, with carriages being shunted around in the dark, really captures the sometimes slow and unpredictable nature of these journeys.
And the lack of a restaurant car on that leg meant relying on whatever snacks they brought, which underscores the need for self-reliance. No fine dining car then.
Yes, definitely not a luxury cruise experience. And the toilets being locked on the train while stopped meant a trek out to station toilets in temperatures as low as minus 15 degrees C.
Minus 15. Brr. That adds a layer of genuine hardship to the adventure.
Definitely tests your endurance.
The border formalities sound memorable, too. Any funny stories?
They do. The author mentions young Mongolian women in green uniforms and a humanist size of caps theory related to rank, plus a minor drama involving a traveling companion, Michael Flynn, whose passport photo apparently caused issues because he only resembled it when smiling.
That's a classic travel story detail.
Sure.
Bureaucracy meets reality. And the Russian border station. Any better.
Depicted as having a well-stocked shop, primarily selling vodka.
Naturally.
Contrasting with the experience at the bank there, which was described as slow, unhelpful, and surly, only converting dollars if cash rubles were deposited first.
So easy to get vodka, difficult to get money converted. Particular kind of efficiency, perhaps.
Priorities.
Exactly. And then the arrival at Lake Baikal, one of the highlights of the journey, but disappointment ensued. Oh no, what happened? It was shrouded in mist.
Yes, described as steam-like mist, caused by the extremely cold temperature, but the lake itself not freezing. This denied them the famous views of the vast frozen lake, a real anticlimax after traveling so far.
A beautiful phenomenon, I guess, but not what you hope to see. And finally, St. Petersburg. What were the impressions?
Described with observations on key landmarks, the Hermitage Museum is noted for its immense size and sometimes disjointed layout, making it challenging to navigate.
I've heard that. Easy to get lost.
Seems so. The Faberge egg exhibition prompted the author to question all the fuss around them, suggesting a personal lack of enthusiasm for the famous ornate eggs, although acknowledging they were well-crafted. Tsar Nicholas's study is also mentioned.
Any other impressions of the city? Hotels? Food?
They stayed at the Moskva Hotel, described as impersonal but comfortable, with a notable location near the graves of famous composers and writers like Tchaikovsky and Dostoevsky.
Wow, quite the neighborhood.
The city itself was found to be expensive, with enjoyable meals and drinkable Russian beer, though the Russian wine was deemed poor.
Good to know. But the highlight seems to have been a specific personal connection.
Absolutely. The memorable dinner with Yuri, a Russian ceramic painter celebrating Russian Orthodox Christmas, stands out.
Ah, that sounds special.
The author details the generous hospitality, delicious food, and ample vodka consumed. Yuri is described as a great raconteur, sharing his views on life under the Soviet system and a range of other topics. These personal interactions often provide the richest understanding of a place and its people.
These travel pieces truly underscore that the individuals within the legal profession in Victoria in 2005 were not just defined by their work. They were adventurers, observers, curious individuals experiencing different cultures and navigating challenges far from home.
They add a vital layer of humanity and perspective, showing that the world of law connects with the wider world in unexpected ways. It's not an isolated bubble.
Finally, the sources offer reflections on leisure activities and deeper thoughts on the nature of law itself. Bit of work-life balance, maybe.
We hear about specific sports events, highlighting camaraderie and interprofessional rivalry, a sailing race where the motto was, "Participating is winning." Perhaps a nod to the effort rather than just the result. Very sporting.
And the annual cricket match between barristers and solicitors, a grudge match.
Yes, this sounds like a keenly contested tradition, battling for the Sir Henry Winnicky Trophy. The piece includes specific, humorous anecdotes about players Jim Ryan's nagging wrong-uns, a type of spin bowling,
Love the terminology.
Mark Fellman's solid batting, Morty Bromberg's quick runs. The author expresses the sheer joy felt in finally beating the solicitors after being on the losing side many times, which captures the spirit of friendly, long-standing competition.
There's also mention of an event focused on women in law.
The Portia's Breakfast, described as a networking event for women in the profession, also serving as a fundraiser for the Women's Legal Service.
That sounds important.
It had apparently become a tradition by 2005, even being referred to as the Oaks Day of the Law, suggesting it was a significant social fixture on the legal calendar.
The sources also provide insights into legal scholarship at the time through book reviews. What were they reading?
Reviews of significant legal texts like Equity and Trusts and Intellectual Property in Australia are included. They are described in terms that highlight their value, providing historical, conceptual, and doctrinal context, offering detailed explanations and critical analysis, encouraging creative thinking, being comprehensive, clear, and up-to-date, and serving as excellent starting points for students and practitioners alike. Standard descriptions, but useful.
Moving to language and interpretation, there's a piece titled A Bit About Words. What's this about?
This delves into the precise meaning and history of certain words, reflecting a lawyer's focus on language. It discusses asperity, noting its older physical sense of roughness before its more common figurative use, meaning harshness or severity. It looks at variant spellings of rough throughout history and touches on the word ruffian, tracing its shift from a genuinely brutal meaning to a sometimes softer, almost colloquial modern use. Language changes.
And there's an interesting point about meaning in there.
Yes. The piece suggests that meaning is shaped not just by the words that are used, but also by what isn't said. It speaks to the importance of context, implication, and silence in communication, something crucial in legal drafting and interpretation. Reading between the lines.
This ties into a classic aphorism quoted in the sources about interpreting a contract. Which one is that?
That timeless phrase. It's not what the parties meant to say, but what the words they used mean.
The objective approach.
Exactly. It's a concise encapsulation of the objective approach to contractual interpretation, focusing on the plain meaning of the language used in the document itself, rather than speculating about the parties' subjective intentions.
The impact of technology on legal practice is also a topic, surprisingly, even back in 2005. What were they saying about computers then?
Yes, there's a piece reflecting on computers and law. The author lists the perceived pros and cons. The pros included finding things quickly and the convenience of a portable CD player.
A portable CD player. Takes you back.
Doesn't it just? But the cons list sounds much longer.
Oh, what were the gripes?
It is. The author notes issues like American spelling creeping into documents.
That's a common complaint.
The potential for endless editing leading to a perpetual state of incompleteness, documents that look flash but lack substance, technology eroding promptness, perhaps due to distraction or over-reliance, and the constant annoyance of software updates.
Some things never change. And there's a humorous speculation linking technology and efficiency.
Yes, the wry observation that compliance with court time limits is perhaps inversely proportional to the number of computers in solicitors' offices.
Huh. That's brilliant. It captures a common frustration with technology adding complexity rather than simply solving problems.
Very much so.
Finally, the sources delve into a more philosophical aspect of law, the tension between certainty and uncertainty. This sounds deep.
This is a fundamental challenge. The sources note that since the High Court is no longer subject to appeals to the Privy Council in London, as it once was, and now has the power to overrule its own previous decisions, it introduces a degree of uncertainty into the law.
Because a decision made today might be overturned by a future court with a different composition or perspective. The law isn't set in stone.
Exactly. The source gives the example of the High Court case Tiore Tau v. Commonwealth, where the court overruled a previous decision, illustrating how interpretations of the law can shift depending on the membership of the court. Even among highly respected justices, there can be divided opinions, making it difficult to predict outcomes with absolute certainty, especially in complex or evolving areas of law.
And the consequence of this uncertainty for people trying to navigate the legal system, what does it mean for them?
It means that litigation can be risky, expensive, and unpredictable. This is why the source notes that parties often prefer out-of-court solutions like mediation or arbitration.
To gain certainty and avoid the risks of litigation. Makes sense.
Precisely. These alternative methods offer greater control over the process and outcome, avoid lengthy delays, and prevent negative publicity, which could be particularly important for corporations trying to avoid impacts on share value or jeopardizing projects.
Right.
The source quotes the saying, "The best side of the court is the outside," which perfectly encapsulates this preference for resolving disputes privately.
It's a powerful practical consequence of that underlying theoretical uncertainty in the law.
It shows how fundamental legal principles have real-world implications for how people conduct their affairs and resolve conflicts.
And finally, the sources conclude with a reflection on the opening of the legal year, using the Sermon on the Mount as an analogy. How does that fit in?
This moves into the ethical and spiritual dimensions of the legal profession. The analogy contrasts the law of the land, the legal system we operate under, which primarily judges outward actions, with the law of the kingdom of God, as described in the Sermon on the Mount, which judges not just actions, but thoughts and desires.
And the sermon presents seemingly impossible moral imperatives, like be perfect, a much higher bar.
Yes, highlighting a different standard. The legal system judges what you do, holding you accountable for your conduct in the public sphere. But the sermon suggests a higher standard that judges the inner person, your intentions, your thoughts, a standard that is arguably impossible to meet fully in human terms.
It draws a distinction between legal rectitude and spiritual or ethical perfection, between being lawful and being good, perhaps.
It does, and this reflection comes in the context of the Mass of the Holy Spirit for the legal profession, an event mentioned in the sources. This gathering is described as a time for lawyers, bonded by Spirit, working for the good, to pray for faithfulness to their calling and for the wisdom that combines both compassion and truth.
With St. Thomas More mentioned as the patron saint of lawyers,
A figure known for his unwavering principles even in the face of immense pressure. This closing reflection adds a profound layer to the deep dive, reminding us that for some within the profession, their work is not just a job or a set of rules, but a calling with deep ethical and even spiritual dimensions.
wow, what a journey this deep dive has taken us on. We started with dry legal titles and administrative notes, and we've ended up contemplating the nature of justice, the challenges of reform, the business of law, the human stories behind the titles, adventurous travels across continents, and the philosophical and spiritual dimensions of the legal calling.
It really shows the richness that can be found when you dig into seemingly disparate sources. You get this incredible, multifaceted view of a specific world and time, the Victorian legal landscape in 2005, seeing the big structural issues, the political battles, the administrative challenges, the cultural touchstones, and the personal experiences all intertwined.
Exactly. It's not just about the law itself. It's about the people practicing it, the pressures they faced, the traditions they cherished, the world they explored, and the questions they wrestled with, both professionally and personally. You get a real sense of a living community.
And perhaps the most valuable takeaway for you, listening, is to consider how these glimpses into legal reform, professional life, and personal reflection from 2 decades ago might still resonate today. How do these themes, the balance between tradition and change, the tension between certainty and uncertainty, the challenge of communicating complex ideas clearly, the human element in professional life, how do they continue to play out not just in law, but perhaps in your own field, your own work, or your own life?
That's a great question. What aspect of this deep dive into the Victorian legal world, seen through these eyes, sparks your own curiosity to look a little deeper or ask a new question?
Something to ponder.
Thank you for bringing us these sources and joining us for this deep dive. We hope you found it as insightful and thought-provoking as we did.